Before we begin today's story, a quick friendly reminder. If you enjoy tales of outrageous HOAs, property battles, and neighborhood drama where justice eventually finds its way, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep sharing these unbelievable stories, and you don't want to miss the next one. Now, let's get into it. They say paradise is never quite as perfect as it first appears. At least, that's what I discovered the hard way. 3 years ago, I thought I had left behind the stress of city life forever. I had sold my contracting business, packed up with my wife and teenage daughter, and bought what felt like our dream property. 4 acres of rolling land at the edge of a sleepy subdivision tucked away in the Texas Hill Country. The house itself wasn't extraordinary, but the land was. A long gravel driveway curled through oak and cedar, leading to a quiet home set far back from the road. Every evening, the smell of wildflowers drifted across the porch, and the sound of cicadas filled the air. It was the kind of peace I thought money couldn't buy, except it had cost me a fortune. The detail that sealed the deal was the driveway. It wasn't part of the subdivision. I had purchased it separately, carved from an old ranch decades ago. That road was mine, private and untouchable by the neighborhood's dreaded Homeowners Association. I paid an extra $90,000 for that slice of independence, and I told myself it was worth every penny. The subdivision itself, Willow Bend Commons, was exactly the kind of place I wanted to avoid. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, neighbors who waved but seemed to be measuring you with their eyes. I didn't mind them as long as they stayed on their side of the property line. But if you've ever dealt with an HOA, you already know peace never lasts. For the first year, life was quiet. My wife, a school administrator, tended to her jasmine plants on the porch. My daughter, an ambitious high school junior, buried herself in textbooks and college dreams. We thought we had escaped the rat race, leaving only bird songs and sunsets. But beneath that calm, trouble was already brewing. Her name was Victoria Ashford, the HOA president. She was the type of person who introduced herself with a business card, even to neighbors who lived 2 doors down. Her white luxury SUV gleamed like a mobile advertisement for her real estate office, and her smile never quite reached her eyes. She thrived on rules, on order, and above all, on control. At first, she didn't pay much attention to us. After all, we were technically outside her jurisdiction. But people like Victoria can't stand boundaries, especially when they cut through their vision of a perfectly managed community. She must have looked at our gravel road every day and seen it as an imperfection, a rustic scar on the otherwise polished landscape of Willow Bend Commons. The first signs were small. One morning, I found a neatly folded flyer tucked into my mailbox, even though it was illegal for her to use it that way. Community Beautification Project. It read in bold letters. It went on about improving property values, upgrading infrastructure, and ensuring safety standards. At the bottom, a line in italics caught my eye. All access roads should reflect the community's high standards. I laughed it off at first. After all, my road wasn't hers to control. But the seeds of her plan were already there. A month later, I noticed stakes hammered into the ground near the entrance of my driveway. Bright orange survey tape fluttered in the breeze. I knew the look of construction markers all too well. My years in the contracting business had taught me the signs. Someone was planning something. When I asked a survey crew about it, they said they were working off an HOA work order labeled Future Roadway Improvement. The words burned like acid in my chest. My road, the one I had bought specifically to remain private, was being targeted as if it belonged to them. I stormed down to the HOA office, a converted storefront at the edge of the strip mall. Inside, plaques of Community Excellence Awards lined the walls, and the air reeked of expensive perfume. Victoria sat behind the desk like a queen on a throne, flipping through papers with a self-satisfied smirk. Her tone was syrupy but sharp when she explained. According to her, my gravel road was out of compliance with neighborhood safety standards. It posed hazards for school buses and lowered property values by looking rustic and unprofessional. She waved a map in my face, one that conveniently highlighted my road as a planned thoroughfare. There was no legal basis, no contract, nothing in writing, only her audacity. Still, I left that office seething. People like her rarely bluff without follow-through. 2 weeks later, my suspicions became reality. I woke up to the choking stench of hot asphalt. From my bedroom window, I saw a paving crew spreading black tar over my gravel drive. My fence posts had been yanked out and tossed aside. My private markers had been smashed. Where my quiet gravel road once lay, the shiny black surface of a suburban street now stretched like an open wound. Pinned to the front door of my house was a letter. It declared that the community access upgrade project had been successfully completed and that my share of the assessment was $4,200, payable within 30 days. At the bottom, in a flourish of arrogance, was Victoria's signature. She had paved over my independence and billed me for the privilege. As I stood there, the acrid smell of tar burning my nostrils, I realized this wasn't just about a road. It was about control. And if I didn't fight back, this so-called community would swallow me whole. That night, I sat in my garage surrounded by the evidence of what had been done. Broken fence posts, crumpled survey tape, a letter dripping with entitlement. The anger in my chest hardened into something sharper. Resolve. I had spent years in construction. I knew zoning laws, permit requirements, and every dirty trick developers used to push people around. If Victoria thought I was an easy mark, she had chosen the wrong neighbor to tangle with. But as I planned my first move, I couldn't shake one thought from my mind. She wouldn't stop here. This was only the opening move in a much bigger game, and I was about to find out just how far she was willing to go. The days after the paving felt like living in someone else's nightmare. Every time I drove across that strip of fresh asphalt, the tires humming against the blacktop reminded me of what had been stolen from me. My gravel road, the one that had given our home its rustic peace, was gone. In its place stood the first monument to the HOA's arrogance. Neighbors began treating it as if it really was theirs. Teenagers parked their cars at the entrance, their music shaking windows late into the night. Joggers and dog walkers strolled past our house like it was a public park. Even delivery vans used the road as a shortcut, rattling up the driveway without hesitation. It was as if the new asphalt had erased the boundary between private and community. My wife tried to stay calm, reminding me we had paperwork proving our ownership. My daughter, however, hated the constant traffic. She closed her curtains during the day, saying it felt like living in a fishbowl. Privacy, the one thing we had bought at such cost, had vanished overnight. I knew I had to strike back, but I also knew better than to lash out blindly. HOA boards thrive on neighbors losing their tempers. They build cases around outbursts, turning righteous anger into evidence of hostile behavior. I needed proof, not rage, so I started documenting. Every car that parked overnight, every trespasser who wandered onto our land, every package left at the wrong door. I wrote it all down. I set up cameras, hidden at first, then more obvious as the pattern grew undeniable. Within a week, I had hours of footage of strangers treating my property like their own. But footage alone wouldn't stop Victoria. I needed to hit her where she thought she was strongest: her paperwork. In construction, there is one unbreakable rule: nothing happens without permits. Roads, sidewalks, signage, drainage, all of it requires approval. And when I checked with the county planning office, my suspicions were confirmed. Not a single permit had been filed for the so-called community access upgrade. That discovery felt like oxygen after weeks of suffocation. It meant every inch of asphalt, every ripped-out fence post, every decorative pillar at the subdivision entrance was not just an insult. It was a violation of the law. I filed a formal complaint the same afternoon. Within 48 hours, bright orange stopwork notices fluttered from the new entrance pillars like flags of rebellion. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt momentum shift. But Victoria was not the kind of person to back down. If anything, the stopwork orders only made her more dangerous. She pivoted from construction to manipulation, shifting the battlefield from permits to public opinion. The HOA's next newsletter carried a headline that turned my stomach: "Community Safety Threatened by Road Dispute." Beneath it, a neatly written article accused an uncooperative property owner of endangering school buses. blocking emergency access, and lowering neighborhood values. My name wasn't printed, but everyone knew who they meant. Suddenly, grocery store runs turned into gauntlets of cold stares and whispered comments. My wife came home shaken after being cornered in the parking lot by 3 neighbors demanding to know why we were risking the children's safety. My daughter's friends began avoiding our house, claiming their parents said it was too controversial. The isolation was deliberate. Victoria knew that social pressure could break a person faster than legal battles. She wanted me painted as the villain before the real fight even began. But if she thought I was alone, she was mistaken. Quietly, allies began to emerge. My neighbor across the road, a retired Marine, slipped me copies of HOA meeting notes he'd overheard during his evening walks. Another resident, a local doctor, shared stories of harassment she had endured when refusing one of Victoria's offers to buy her lot at a discount. It became clear this wasn't just about my driveway. Victoria had been building a private empire through intimidation, lowball offers, and shell companies. My road was simply the keystone she needed to complete her vision, a luxury development stitched together from unwilling sellers. Knowing her endgame gave me purpose. I wasn't just fighting for my property. I was standing in the way of a scheme much larger, much dirtier than anyone suspected. Still, knowledge alone wouldn't stop her. The real war would be fought in courtrooms and commission offices, where paperwork mattered more than outrage. I hired a private investigator, an old sheriff's deputy with a nose for corruption, and ordered a full land survey with GPS coordinates. The cost stung thousands out of pocket, but it was a necessary investment. Meanwhile, Victoria escalated. She posted guards at the entrance, men in golf carts who demanded ID before allowing vehicles down what she now called the community thoroughfare. They flagged me on my own property, clipboard in hand, as if I were trespassing on my land. The absurdity made me laugh, but it also filled me with a cold, controlled rage. Security theater was an intimidation tactic, nothing more. She wanted me humiliated in front of my own family. She wanted me to feel powerless. But the thing about bullies is simple. The louder they get, the more mistakes they make. And I was patient enough to let her dig her own hole deeper. The county's investigation into unpermitted work was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, the private investigator uncovered property transfers that smelled like fraud, while the survey proved beyond doubt that my road was private and untouchable. Piece by piece, I was assembling a case strong enough to not just defend myself, but to expose the rot at the heart of the HOA. Yet even as I prepared my counterattack, Victoria prepared hers. And her next move would be less about paperwork and more about psychological warfare. By the time I realized how far she was willing to go, the battle lines were already shifting from property rights into something darker, something designed to break me at the core. If the paving of my driveway was the opening strike, and the forged newsletter was the propaganda, then what came next was pure psychological warfare. Victoria shifted her tactics from paperwork and construction crews to the one battlefield where she believed she had absolute control: the minds of my neighbors. It started quietly. Groups of residents began walking past our property in small clusters, armed not with tools or paperwork, but with phones and clipboards. They called it a beautification walk. In reality, it was reconnaissance. Each morning and afternoon, they strolled by slowly, pausing to point at our hedges, snapping photographs of our lawn, whispering to each other as if our home was a case study in neglect. The first time I saw it, I laughed. By the 5th time, it felt less like curiosity and more like surveillance. The privacy we had bought at such cost was being eroded by the steady click of camera shutters and the cold stares of people who had once waved politely when passing. My daughter stopped opening her curtains altogether. She said it felt like living in an aquarium, with strangers pressing their noses against the glass. My wife grew restless, her once relaxing garden time interrupted by the sight of Victoria herself leading these processions, clipboard in hand like a teacher grading an unruly student. Then came the social media posts. Photos of our home began appearing on the neighborhood Facebook group, paired with captions dripping with passive aggression. "Interesting landscaping choices," one read. "Wonder if this meets fire safety standards," said another. Each post gathered dozens of comments from neighbors who had no idea of the legal boundaries of our property, parroting Victoria's narrative that we were endangering the community. It was digital harassment dressed up as concern, a modern-day pillory where the accused is paraded before the crowd without trial. And every day, the drumbeat grew louder. But intimidation wasn't enough for Victoria. She wanted pressure from every direction. That's when the county clerk's office suddenly lost my survey documents. When I went in to demand answers, I was met by a young woman whose last name, coincidentally, matched Victoria's. She claimed there was no record of my property permits and that I would need to reapply for access rights, at a cost of nearly $3,000 and a wait time of 6 months. It wasn't bureaucracy. It was sabotage dressed up in government stationery. Meanwhile, mysterious problems began cropping up around the house. Our irrigation system failed during the hottest week of summer, wilting half the plants my wife had nurtured for years. When I dug into the soil, I found the water line neatly severed, cut with surgical precision right where it ran under the newly paved driveway. Before I could even call a plumber, the phone rang. On the other end was Victoria, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. She said she had heard we were planning to tamper with the new community road and warned that any interference would require a $5,000 damage deposit to the HOA. The implication was clear. She had broken it, and she expected me to pay her for fixing it. It was extortion, plain and simple. But she wasn't done. That same week, I received notice from my insurance company that an anonymous complaint had been filed about unsafe commercial activity on my property. Apparently, my garage workshop counted as industrial equipment in Victoria's twisted version of events. The company demanded a higher premium, thousands more a year, unless I proved otherwise. One by one, the pillars of stability in our lives were being chipped away. Privacy, finances, reputation. It wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was a campaign designed to exhaust us, to bleed us dry until selling out felt like the only option. But if that was her plan, she underestimated me. I had spent decades in the construction world, watching developers play dirty with permits, inspectors, and neighbors. I had seen intimidation campaigns before, but always from the outside. This time, I was the target, and I wasn't about to fold. The private investigator I had hired started uncovering threads that explained the desperation. Victoria wasn't just a control freak running an HOA. She was a developer in disguise, using shell companies to quietly buy up surrounding lots. One by one, she had acquired properties around ours, all with the intent of assembling a luxury estate project. My 4 acres, with its private access road, was the keystone of the entire plan. Without it, her empire collapsed. That realization reframed everything. The harassment wasn't random cruelty. It was business. My refusal to join her HOA or sell my land wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the one obstacle that could bankrupt her. I doubled down on my preparations. Trail cameras were installed around the property, hidden high in the trees, capturing every midnight trespasser and every instance of damage. I organized the paperwork into binders, building a war room in my garage. Each file, each photograph, each timestamp was another bullet in the legal arsenal I was assembling. And I wasn't alone. My neighbors, once too fearful to speak, began quietly approaching me. The retired Marine across the street installed security equipment on his own dime to help me track nighttime activity. A local teacher shared records showing how her garbage collection mysteriously stopped the week she refused Victoria's lowball offer to buy her lot. A doctor revealed she had been threatened with fines after declining to sell a corner parcel. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged. Anyone who resisted selling to Victoria faced harassment until they either broke or gave in. My battle wasn't unique. It was part of a larger scheme, one that had already claimed victims. And now I was the last and most important holdout. But Victoria made a crucial mistake. She escalated too quickly. One evening, a crew of workers rolled in under cover of darkness, floodlights blazing, and began installing speed bumps and signage along the road. No permits, no notice, just unmarked trucks carving their will into the asphalt. And there, in the glare of the lights, was Victoria herself, barking orders in a tracksuit like a general commanding troops. The cameras caught everything. License plates, faces, equipment. Proof undeniable and clear. As I watched the footage later that night, anger gave way to something else. Satisfaction. Every desperate move she made was another nail in her coffin. She believed she was tightening the noose around me, but in reality, she was weaving the rope for her own downfall. Still, I knew the worst was yet to come. People like her don't back down gracefully. They escalate until there's nothing left to burn. And if the property damage and intimidation were just the opening salvos, then what she was preparing next would push this neighborhood conflict into territory none of us had ever imagined. The battle was about to move from harassment to open confrontation. And I was ready. By the time the asphalt cooled on those midnight speed bumps, it was no longer a dispute over property. It had become open warfare. And like all wars, once one side escalates to reckless extremes, the other side has no choice but to prepare for the inevitable clash. Victoria's campaign of fear had already frayed our peace of mind. My wife woke each night at the sound of car doors slamming, convinced someone was prowling outside. My daughter no longer invited her friends over, embarrassed by the constant presence of patrol carts circling like sharks. I kept a watchful eye on the cameras, each new video clip feeding a growing archive of evidence. But evidence alone doesn't stop bullies. And Victoria was growing bolder by the day. The week after the speed bumps appeared, our mailbox was shattered with what looked like a baseball bat. The jagged metal post leaned sideways like a snapped bone, and the ground around it was littered with shards of glass beer bottles. My cameras, ever watchful, caught two HOA board members in hooded sweatshirts laughing as they staggered away at 3 in the morning. The same morning, a bright orange notice appeared on my door. According to the HOA, I was being fined $500 per day for failure to maintain common property. The absurdity made me laugh out loud. My private driveway, now claimed as common, but the intent was clear. They wanted to bury me under financial pressure until I either folded or sold. It wasn't just us anymore. Other neighbors began quietly sharing their stories. A retired couple on the far side of the subdivision admitted their garbage pickup had mysteriously stopped after refusing one of Victoria's offers. Another family confessed that their water line had been damaged twice in a single month after resisting a buyout. One by one, the victims surfaced, each story stitching together a tapestry of intimidation too deliberate to be coincidence. And still, she escalated. Flyers appeared on car windshields throughout the neighborhood, claiming I operated an illegal business out of my garage. False complaints were lodged with the fire marshal about hazardous equipment on my property. Even Child Protective Services came knocking one afternoon after an anonymous tip alleged unsafe living conditions. The inspector found nothing, of course, but the humiliation of having them comb through our home left a bitter taste that lingered for weeks. Victoria's strategy was transparent. Overwhelm us with stress, bury us in bureaucracy, and make daily life unbearable until surrender felt like relief. It was harassment disguised as civic duty, extortion masquerading as community spirit. But she was reckless, and reckless people leave footprints. The private investigator I had hired delivered a damning report. Victoria's web of shell companies, each with different names but the same hidden ownership, had acquired nearly a dozen lots surrounding mine. She wasn't running an HOA, she was running a development scheme. And the only thing standing in her way was my stubborn refusal to join her empire. Her desperation made sense now. She had borrowed heavily, using projected HOA income as collateral. Without my property to tie it all together, her house of cards was ready to collapse. She wasn't just fighting for power, she was fighting for survival. And desperation breeds mistakes. One Friday afternoon, while my wife was loading groceries in the school parking lot, Victoria approached her with that predatory smile. She offered $25,000 in cash if I agreed to drop all complaints and stop resisting community progress. My wife, sharp as ever, began recording on her phone. The footage captured everything. The offer of a bribe, the admission that the money came from HOA funds, the smug certainty that we could be bought like any other neighbor. That single recording was more valuable than all my paperwork combined. It wasn't just evidence of corruption, it was evidence of theft, of embezzling HOA money for personal schemes. Still, I didn't strike yet. Timing mattered. If I acted too early, she could wriggle out with excuses. I needed her to feel untouchable, confident enough to expose every trick in her playbook. And she delivered exactly that. The following week, Victoria organized what she called a community action day. The flyers made it sound wholesome. Neighbors gathering to improve shared spaces, complete with promises of barbecue and lemonade. But my cameras captured the truth. Pickup trucks rolled in at dawn, loaded with bolt cutters, sledgehammers, and power tools. A small army of volunteers, many wearing matching Willow Bend Pride shirts, lined up like a militia preparing for battle. Their target was obvious. My property. Survey markers, security cameras, private signs. They came to tear it all down in a single act of collective vandalism. And leading them, clipboard in hand, was Victoria, barking encouragement like a general rallying her troops. I had expected this moment. My allies were ready. The retired Marine neighbor positioned himself with video equipment, documenting every illegal act in high definition. The private investigator coordinated with the sheriff's department. And most importantly, my wife and daughter were safely away visiting family in Austin. When the crowd surged toward my property line, tools raised, the sheriff's deputy stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise with calm authority. He declared the line trespassing, warned them to step back, and watched as Victoria, drunk on power, crossed onto my land with bolt cutters in hand. That was all it took. The metallic snap of handcuffs echoed across the sudden silence as she and her two most aggressive followers were led away in patrol cars. The barbecue and lemonade were forgotten. The matching shirts suddenly looked like uniforms for a failed rebellion. But the real blow came later that night. Local news crews, whom Victoria herself had invited to film her community improvement, instead broadcast footage of her arrest, complete with the bribery recording leaked by a sympathetic source. For the first time, the narrative shifted. The Queen of Willow Bend Commons wasn't a visionary leader anymore. She was a corrupt schemer caught red-handed. Still, this was only the beginning. Arrests can be smoothed over. Fines can be paid. News cycles move quickly. To truly end her reign, I needed more than embarrassment. I needed undeniable proof of fraud, corruption, and criminal conspiracy strong enough to bring down not just her, but the entire rotten structure she had built. And as fate would have it, that proof was already in my hands, buried in the documents and footage my allies and I had collected. All it needed was the right stage, the right timing, and the right legal trap to spring shut around her empire. The war was far from over. But for the first time since this nightmare began, the balance had shifted. She had tasted her first real defeat. And desperate people, when cornered, don't retreat quietly. They lash out harder. I knew Victoria wouldn't stop. I knew she would double down, risk everything to claw back her crumbling authority. What I didn't yet know was just how much damage she was willing to do, or how high the stakes would climb before justice finally caught her. The arrests during Community Action Day should have been the breaking point. For most people, being hauled away in handcuffs in front of neighbors and news cameras would have been enough to retreat, lick wounds, and rethink every decision. But Victoria was not most people. For her, humiliation wasn't an ending. It was fuel. Within a week, glossy newsletters began appearing in mailboxes across Willow Bend Commons. The front-page headline read like something from a tabloid, "Selfish Neighbor Endangers Community Progress." The article, dripping with indignation, claimed that my illegal obstructions had caused confusion, forced the sheriff's hand, and wasted taxpayer dollars. According to her version, she was the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by one stubborn homeowner who refused to cooperate with reasonable improvements. The brazenness was breathtaking. She had been arrested on camera, yet somehow she spun it into an attack on her leadership. And disturbingly, some people bought it. A few neighbors, perhaps too weary of conflict to question the narrative, repeated her talking points at the grocery store or posted supportive comments online. But beneath the noise, cracks in her empire were spreading fast. The bribery recording circulated beyond the subdivision, picked up by local journalists who smelled a bigger story. Questions began surfacing about how HOA funds were being spent and whether homeowners' dues had been diverted into personal ventures. That's when the legal war began. A thick envelope arrived by certified mail one Monday morning, bearing the letterhead of a law firm I knew all too well. They demanded that I remove all survey markers, signs, and cameras within 7 days, claiming they constituted harassment of HOA members. The threat of a $75,000 lawsuit loomed over every word. I had seen this tactic before in construction disputes. Strategic lawsuits designed not to win, but to exhaust. They wanted me buried in legal fees, drowning in motions and hearings until I gave up. It was the classic playbook of intimidation through paperwork. But I wasn't alone. My attorney, a bulldog of a property rights specialist, recognized the maneuver immediately. Texas had strong protections against exactly this kind of abuse. She filed an anti-SLAPP motion, turning their weapon back on them. If the court agreed, the HOA would not only lose the suit but also be forced to pay my legal fees. The counterstrike rattled them, but it didn't stop them. Instead, they shifted to financial pressure. Out of nowhere, my property tax bill nearly doubled, reflecting improvements made to the road. My insurance company, already rattled by anonymous complaints, demanded an additional premium for commercial liability exposure due to increased traffic. Each new bill arrived like a punch to the gut, draining savings at a steady pace. At night, as I sat surrounded by paperwork in the garage-turned-war room, I felt the weight of it pressing down. Every file folder represented another battlefront. County permits, insurance disputes, HOA fines, civil lawsuits. It was a flood designed to drown me. And yet, amid the chaos, I also saw opportunity. The private investigator continued peeling back layers of Victoria's empire. Her shell companies weren't just buying land, they were leveraged to the hilt. She owed more than $300,000 to lenders. Her credit cards maxed out. Her real estate license teetering under state investigation. The picture was clear. She was desperate, running out of time and money. If I could hold the line, the pressure would crush her. But holding the line wasn't enough. To end this war, I needed to go on offense. That's when my attorney proposed a strategy elegant in its simplicity. Simultaneous filings. On the same day the HOA expected to present their case at the City Planning Commission, we would file a quiet title action confirming my road as private in perpetuity, backed by the original deed language that specifically barred HOA interference. At the same time, we would submit a federal environmental complaint documenting every violation from the unpermitted construction. It was a 1-2 punch designed to hit them where it hurt most: legality and liability. If successful, they would be forced not only to back off my property but also to answer for criminal environmental violations that carried fines heavy enough to bankrupt an organization twice their size. While legal filings moved forward, the neighborhood itself grew restless. Victoria's grip on power was slipping. Homeowners who once nodded obediently at meetings began asking hard questions. Where had their dues gone? Why had insurance premiums risen? Why were board members quietly resigning? And yet, she clung to her image, orchestrating more theatrics. She packed city hearings with supporters, filling rows of chairs with residents holding pre-printed signs about safety and progress. She staged photo opportunities with children waiting at a bus stop near the freshly paved road, as if the asphalt had single-handedly saved their lives. It was theater, and I let her perform, because every performance, every desperate move was being documented. Meanwhile, allies multiplied. The retired Marine neighbor provided military-grade surveillance logs, recording every incident with meticulous precision. The local doctor compiled medical reports of stress-related illnesses linked to harassment, turning neighborly suffering into legal ammunition. A teacher, organized beyond belief, began building spreadsheets tracking financial irregularities in HOA budgets. Piece by piece, the counteroffensive took shape. What had begun as my personal battle was evolving into something larger. A coalition of residents unwilling to tolerate tyranny disguised as community management. But even as our case grew stronger, Victoria unleashed her most dangerous move yet: personal intimidation. My wife was summoned to the superintendent's office after an anonymous complaint claimed her husband's hostile legal actions reflected poorly on her professional judgment. It was a veiled threat to her career, a reminder that no one in our family was safe from the reach of this campaign. I saw the fear in her eyes that evening, and it hardened something inside me. This was no longer about property lines or asphalt. It was about protecting my family from a predator who had mistaken intimidation for power. And predators, when cornered, often turn violent. The night before the Planning Commission hearing, I was jolted awake by the roar of engines. A convoy of unmarked trucks rolled into the subdivision, floodlights blazing as crews worked feverishly under cover of darkness. They weren't just adding speed bumps this time. They were installing new signage, carving drainage ditches, and pouring concrete footings. And in the middle of it all stood Victoria, directing traffic like a foreman, her designer sneakers caked with mud. The footage, captured in crystal clarity by my cameras, was undeniable. Illegal construction, no permits, blatant defiance of stop work orders, all led by the HOA president herself. It was the final piece of evidence we needed, a smoking gun that tied her directly to every violation. As I watched the footage the next morning, exhausted but exhilarated, I knew the turning point had arrived. The legal crossfire was about to explode into the open, and this time, the battlefield was one I had prepared meticulously. The commission hearing would not be the end of the war, but it would mark the moment when the tide turned irreversibly. And I was ready. The morning of the Planning Commission hearing arrived like the calm before a storm. I had spent the night pacing the garage, reviewing every binder, every photograph, every timestamp until my eyes blurred. My attorney assured me we had everything we needed, but the weight of months of harassment pressed heavy on my shoulders. This wasn't just another meeting. This was the moment the war would step into the open. The City Hall chamber was already crowded when I arrived. Rows of chairs were filled with residents of Willow Bend Commons, many wearing matching shirts emblazoned with slogans about safety and progress. Hand-painted signs waved from the back. Fix our roads. Protect our children. Theatrics, carefully orchestrated by Victoria, who stood at the front of the room shaking hands like a politician on election day. She radiated confidence, smiling for the cameras, her posture perfect, her voice polished as she chatted with commissioners before the hearing began. To the casual observer, she looked like the epitome of civic responsibility, a community leader tirelessly advocating for her neighbors. Only those of us who had seen her true face knew the act for what it was: camouflage. When the commissioners called the hearing to order, Victoria launched into her presentation with the zeal of a preacher. She spoke of safety hazards, school buses forced to navigate treacherous gravel, emergency vehicles delayed by illegal obstructions, and the duty of the HOA to ensure the well-being of its members. She gestured dramatically to oversized maps, highlighting my road in bold red, as if it were a festering wound in the heart of the community. Applause rippled through the crowd. For a moment, the theater seemed convincing, but then it was our turn. My attorney rose, calm and deliberate, and began peeling back the curtain. She produced the original deed, highlighting the language that explicitly excluded my driveway from HOA authority. She presented county records showing no permits had ever been filed for the paving, the speed bumps, or the drainage work. She played the recording of Victoria offering my wife a cash bribe, her words echoing through the chamber like a confession. Then came the footage. On the screen appeared crystal-clear video of Victoria, floodlights blazing, directing crews as they tore into my land. The room grew silent as the commissioners watched her bark orders, clipboard in hand, surrounded by unmarked trucks dumping asphalt under the cover of darkness. The silence was deafening. Even her supporters shifted uneasily in their seats. But the knockout blow came last. My attorney submitted the environmental complaint, complete with photographs of runoff from the illegal paving contaminating a nearby creek. The commissioners, bound by state and federal law, could not ignore it. What had been framed as a simple neighborhood dispute was now a matter of environmental violation with criminal implications. Victoria's composure cracked. Her voice rose as she tried to interject, claiming the footage was taken out of context, that the bribe was a personal misunderstanding, that the road had been improved for the good of the children. But the more she spoke, the more desperate she sounded, her polished mask slipping with every sentence. The commissioners conferred briefly, then announced their decision. Effective immediately, all HOA construction projects were suspended pending investigation. The county would be auditing HOA finances, and the environmental complaint was being referred to state authorities. My road, they confirmed, was private property outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some of Victoria's staunchest supporters looked stunned, while others avoided her gaze entirely. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the tide shift. But Victoria wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The very next day, a new letter appeared in my mailbox. This one wasn't from the HOA but from a private law firm representing one of her shell companies. They accused me of defamation, claiming my false accusations had caused financial damages. The demand: retract all statements, dismantle my cameras, and pay $50,000 in compensation. It was a desperate swing, and I knew it. She was throwing everything she had left at me, hoping something, anything, would stick. But desperation is a dangerous state. When cornered, predators don't become rational. They lash out with claws bared, uncaring who gets hurt in the process. And Victoria was now fully cornered. The following weeks turned chaotic. Neighbors who had once cheered her on began demanding refunds for their dues. Board members resigned in rapid succession, unwilling to go down with a sinking ship. The local paper ran a front-page story exposing the bribery video, the unpermitted work, and the mounting debt tied to her shell companies. And yet, she still fought. Lawsuits piled up, each one weaker than the last, but each one draining time and energy. Anonymous complaints flooded every agency imaginable: zoning, fire safety, even animal control. At night, cars idled near our property, headlights glaring into the windows like silent warnings. My war room grew thicker with files, each binder another chapter in a saga that seemed to have no end. And while victories had been won, I knew the final act was still to come. Because someone like Victoria doesn't fade quietly into obscurity. She wasn't just trying to protect her empire anymore. She was trying to survive. And survival makes people dangerous. The investigators weren't finished, the lawsuits weren't over, and the harassment hadn't stopped. If anything, it was intensifying, condensed into a final storm before the collapse. As I stood at the edge of my porch one evening, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon, I realized the truth. The battle wasn't just about property lines or HOA corruption anymore. It had become a test of endurance, of who would break first under the pressure. And I had no intention of breaking. By the time the commission hearing was over and the investigations had begun, Victoria was bleeding power. Her empire of control, built on intimidation, secrecy, and carefully spun lies, was collapsing piece by piece. Board members were resigning, neighbors were questioning dues, and the county had frozen every project she had bulldozed forward. But a cornered enemy is often the most dangerous. And Victoria, cornered for the first time in her reign, lashed out in ways that made the previous months look like child's play. It began with vandalism. Small things at first. Tire tracks cut deep into my front lawn one morning, as though someone had deliberately swerved across it. A set of nails scattered across the entrance of my driveway, waiting for the first unlucky tire. The lock on my workshop door tampered with, scratched and bent but not broken. At first, I brushed it off as petty spite, but petty spite grew bolder. One night, floodlights flashed across my windows as a convoy of cars circled the property, horns blaring, engines revving. My cameras captured license plates belonging to known HOA loyalists, their faces lit by the glow of cell phones recording every moment. It wasn't vandalism anymore. It was intimidation. Then came the letters. Anonymous envelopes filled with threats, some typed, some scrawled in shaky handwriting. Warnings that my family wasn't safe. Promises that accidents happen in neighborhoods where people don't cooperate. I reported each one, but without direct proof, the sheriff's office could do little beyond filing reports. The stress weighed heavy on my family. My wife's hands trembled as she watered her jasmine plants, her once sacred ritual now overshadowed by fear of being watched. My daughter, once fearless, began sleeping with headphones on to drown out the late-night disturbances. Their peace, the very reason we had bought this property, had been stolen. And still, Victoria wasn't finished. One Friday evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the subdivision, my daughter's car alarm blared from the driveway. We rushed outside to find the windshield smashed, the back tires slashed, and a single note under the wiper. Sell now or next time it won't be the car. That was the breaking point. Fear shifted into resolve. Enough was enough. The private investigator I'd hired doubled his surveillance, this time focusing not just on property lines but on individuals. Trail cameras captured late-night meetings between Victoria and a handful of her most loyal followers. License plates linked back to her shell companies. Even more damning, financial records, painstakingly pieced together from public filings, revealed she had diverted over $80,000 of HOA funds into community projects that existed only on paper. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. But even as the case built stronger, Victoria's retaliation grew more reckless. One night, as I sat in the garage reviewing documents, the acrid scent of smoke drifted through the open window. Heart pounding, I sprinted outside to find flames licking at the edge of our fence line. Someone had doused a pile of brush with gasoline and lit it, hoping the wind would carry the blaze toward our home. We managed to extinguish it before it spread. But the message was unmistakable. This wasn't intimidation anymore, it was attempted arson. The sheriff's office responded with urgency this time. Deputies combed the area, collecting samples of the accelerant, taking statements, reviewing footage. And there it was, caught clear as day. Victoria's SUV creeping past minutes before the fire began. It wasn't proof of her striking the match, but it tied her presence to the crime scene. That was when law enforcement began taking the case seriously. Still, Victoria doubled down. She called emergency services with false reports. Ambulances showing up at our door for medical crises that never happened. Police arriving after anonymous calls of domestic disturbances. Each incident left us rattled, humiliated in front of neighbors, but also left a trail of records pointing back to her campaign of harassment. It became clear that she was unraveling. Every move was more desperate than the last, her once carefully curated image of control slipping into chaos. Neighbors who had once supported her began backing away, whispering to each other at meetings, avoiding eye contact when she stormed through the subdivision with her clipboard. But a predator rarely accepts defeat gracefully. She was willing to risk everything, her reputation, her finances, even her freedom, rather than admit she had lost control. The culmination of her retaliation came during what she called a special emergency HOA meeting. Flyers taped to lampposts invited residents to discuss community safety concerns. Curious neighbors trickled into the clubhouse, expecting another round of speeches about roads and property values. What they witnessed instead was a public unraveling. Victoria ranted for nearly an hour, waving documents, calling me a criminal, accusing my family of destroying the neighborhood. She shouted about conspiracies, about corrupt commissioners, about how everyone who questioned her was part of a plot to ruin her. The crowd, once eager to cheer, sat in stunned silence. Some slipped out quietly, others exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the woman they had followed for years was spiraling before their eyes. And then, in her fury, she made the fatal mistake. She admitted on camera, in front of half the neighborhood, that she had used HOA funds to defend the community against me. She admitted to authorizing the paving, the speed bumps, the signage. She even hinted that sometimes drastic measures are necessary when dealing with uncooperative people. Every word was recorded by residents' phones. Within hours, clips circulated online. The Queen of Willow Bend Commons had publicly confessed to misusing funds, violating permits, and targeting a homeowner. It was the crack in the dam we had been waiting for. By the next morning, calls for her resignation flooded the HOA board. Local news stations replayed the footage on loop. Attorneys representing other homeowners began sniffing around, sensing lawsuits ripe for the taking. What had once been my private war was now a community-wide reckoning. But the story wasn't finished. Because people like Victoria don't just disappear after a confession. They claw, they scramble, they lash out until the very last shred of power is ripped from their hands. And I knew her final act was coming. The only question was how much destruction she would leave in her wake before the end. By the time the video of Victoria's meltdown spread through the neighborhood, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. For months, she had controlled the narrative with newsletters, staged photo ops, and whispered rumors. But now her own words, her rage, her admissions, her smug boasts about drastic measures, were out in the open, stripped of spin. Neighbors who once followed her with blind loyalty now questioned everything. Some were furious, realizing their HOA dues had been siphoned into projects that never existed. Others felt betrayed, embarrassed they had defended her even as evidence piled up. And a small but growing number saw what I had seen all along. Victoria wasn't a protector of the community. She was a predator cloaked in authority. The immediate fallout was swift. An emergency meeting of the remaining HOA board members, those who hadn't already resigned, was called within 48 hours. I wasn't invited, but word traveled fast. Shouting could be heard from the clubhouse, windows glowing late into the night as arguments spilled over. By morning, half of the board had stepped down, and the others announced a temporary suspension of operations, pending a financial review. It was the beginning of the end. But predators rarely surrender quietly, and Victoria had no intention of walking away. The next week, the subdivision was blanketed with glossy flyers. Her face, airbrushed and smiling, appeared above bold letters, "Community Strong." The message was clear. She painted herself as the victim of lies, the target of outsiders who didn't understand Willow Bend Commons. She claimed the video had been maliciously edited, the accusations politically motivated. She begged for unity, framing herself as the only one strong enough to protect the neighborhood from chaos. But the act rang hollow. Too many people had seen the truth. Too many had suffered under her reign. The whispers of dissent grew louder, the once proud supporters now avoiding her calls, her messages, her invitations. Behind the scenes, the legal walls were closing in. County auditors picked apart the HOA's books, uncovering a labyrinth of payments to shell companies with no records of work performed. Thousands of dollars had vanished into consulting fees and infrastructure assessments, none of which had ever materialized. The sheriff's department compiled reports of harassment, vandalism, and attempted arson, cross-referenced with footage and witness testimony. State investigators reviewed the environmental violations, their patience worn thin by months of stonewalling. Piece by piece, the empire cracked, and still Victoria fought. She filed new lawsuits, each one weaker than the last, claiming slander, harassment, even emotional damages. Judges dismissed them one by one, citing lack of evidence, abusive process, or outright frivolity. Each dismissal left her deeper in debt, her reputation more tarnished. Her personal life began unraveling, too. The private investigator I'd hired uncovered that her real estate license was under suspension, her credit cards maxed, her SUV repossessed under the cover of night. Neighbors whispered about foreclosure notices, about late-night visits from debt collectors, about her once immaculate home now showing signs of neglect. The predator had become prey, and yet, she refused to admit defeat. One night, long after most of the neighborhood had gone quiet, I was woken by the sound of pounding on my front door. Through the peephole, I saw her. Hair disheveled, eyes wild, clipboard clutched in her hands like a shield. She screamed accusations through the wood, shouting about stolen property, about conspiracies, about how I had ruined her life. Her voice cracked with rage, with desperation, with the unmistakable sound of someone unraveling. I didn't open the door. I didn't need to. My cameras captured everything. Her rants preserved forever as proof of harassment. Deputies arrived minutes later, guiding her away in handcuffs once more. This time, there were no neighbors rushing to her defense. Only silence, broken by the occasional flicker of porch lights as people watched from behind curtains. It was the moment the neighborhood realized she was finished. The following week brought the official blow. A court order froze all HOA accounts pending a full investigation. Residents were told to stop paying dues until further notice. The county declared the roadwork illegal and began tearing out the speed bumps, leaving the once pristine subdivision scarred and messy. News outlets ran headline after headline. HOA president arrested again. Financial scandal rocks suburban community. Residents demand answers. The empire had collapsed. But even in ruins, Victoria still tried to claw back control. She appeared at one final meeting, standing before a crowd of weary homeowners, begging for a second chance. She spoke of misunderstandings, of betrayal, of how she had only ever wanted to protect property values. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, her once commanding presence reduced to a flicker of its former self. This time, no one clapped, no one nodded, no one stood with her. The silence spoke louder than any words. That night, she packed her belongings into a borrowed pickup truck. Neighbors reported seeing her drive away under cover of darkness, leaving behind a house she could no longer afford, a reputation in ruins, and a community she had once ruled like a queen now united in their relief at her absence. But the story didn't end with her departure. The damage she had caused lingered like a scar. Roads torn apart by unpermitted work, bank accounts drained by theft, families traumatized by months of intimidation. My own property, though legally secured, still bore the marks of vandalism, the scars of fire, the echoes of fear. And even as she vanished into the night, I knew the final chapter was still to be written. Investigators weren't finished. Courts hadn't closed their books. And the weight of justice moved slowly but steadily. Victoria was gone from Willow Bend Commons. But she wasn't free. Not yet. Victoria may have fled Willow Bend Commons under cover of night, but fleeing didn't mean escaping. The investigations she had triggered with her arrogance and recklessness didn't end when she packed her belongings into a pickup truck. They followed her like shadows, patient and relentless. For weeks after her departure, the neighborhood felt caught between relief and unease. The constant surveillance, the harassment, the intimidation, all of it stopped the moment she vanished. Yet the scars remained. Broken fences, damaged cars, vandalized lawns, and the smoldering memory of a fire set too close to my home to be coincidence. My wife watered her jasmine with steady hands again, but her eyes still flicked toward the road at the sound of any approaching engine. My daughter opened her curtains once more, but only halfway, as if still bracing for prying eyes. The subdivision itself looked battered. The illegally paved road cracked under the weight of neglect. The speed bumps, hastily poured and now crumbling, left cars scraping their undersides. Stop work notices fluttered in the wind, a permanent reminder of the arrogance that had brought everything crashing down. Neighbors gathered more openly now, no longer afraid to whisper their frustrations. Stories spilled like floodwaters, threats, fines, intimidation, lowball offers. Everyone had a tale of being targeted, pressured, or humiliated by the woman who had once called herself their protector. And then the legal hammer dropped. The county audit revealed what we had already suspected. Tens of thousands of dollars siphoned into shell companies, invoices for projects that had never existed, payments made to accounts that traced back to Victoria herself. It was embezzlement in its purest form, theft wrapped in the language of community service. The state environmental agency added their own charges. Contaminated runoff from the illegal paving had damaged a protected creek bed, killing fish and plant life along its banks. The fines alone reached into six figures, enough to ruin any organization. And then came the criminal charges: fraud, embezzlement, vandalism, arson, harassment. Each accusation was another weight dragging her deeper into the quicksand of her own making. Warrants were issued, her face plastered across local news broadcasts not as a respected leader but as a wanted felon. The day deputies escorted her into the courthouse, cameras flashing, neighbors watched with grim satisfaction. The Queen of Willow Bend Commons, once untouchable and feared, now shuffled in handcuffs, her once pristine image shattered beyond repair. But justice wasn't only about her punishment. It was about rebuilding what she had broken. The HOA board, gutted by resignations and scandal, dissolved entirely under court order. A receiver was appointed to manage the community's finances, untangling the web of theft and debt. Dues were suspended until the accounts could be restored, a small mercy for neighbors who had watched their money vanish. My own case concluded with a quiet title judgment in my favor, permanently affirming my driveway as private property, untouchable by any future HOA. It was more than a victory, it was vindication. Every late night in the garage, every binder of evidence, every moment of fear had been worth it. And yet the cost lingered. Trust in the neighborhood had been shattered. Families who had once shared block parties and holiday lights now eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who had been complicit and who had resisted. Some sold their homes, unwilling to stay where memories of fear still lingered. Others dug in, determined to reclaim the community from the ashes. For me, the war left a different kind of mark. My wife's garden bloomed again, but she never forgot the night she found her car slashed and her career threatened. My daughter graduated and left for college with a sharper understanding of how cruelty hides behind authority. And I, though I had won, found myself weary of battles, tired of constantly watching the cameras, waiting for another shoe to drop. But slowly, peace returned. The subdivision quieted. The sound of construction crews vanished. The patrol carts disappeared. The only traffic on my driveway was my own, the way it had always been meant to be. Sunsets once again bled across the horizon without the shadow of floodlights, and the cicadas sang uninterrupted. As for Victoria, her empire crumbled in full view. Convicted on multiple counts, sentenced to years of probation and restitution she could never hope to repay, she faded into the background of public memory. No longer a queen, no longer feared, just another cautionary tale of arrogance, greed, and the illusion of control. And that was the true reckoning. Not just her punishment, but the reminder that no empire built on fear and lies can last forever. When I sat on my porch one evening, the air warm and heavy with the scent of jasmine, I thought back to the day I had first driven up the gravel road that once defined my freedom. It had been paved over, scarred, fought for, and finally restored, not just as a strip of land, but as a symbol of resistance. I realized then that this story wasn't just about me. It was about every neighbor who stood up against intimidation, every family who refused to be bullied, every voice that spoke when silence would have been easier. And though the scars would remain, so would the lesson. A community ruled by fear will always crumble. But a community that stands together, no matter how small, can topple even the most arrogant of empires.